Welcome to Aquatics by Nature. As my regular viewers will know, this tank was actually set up in 1995, so it very much predates the whole idea of the Walstad or the dirtied aquarium as it's so often called today. Subsequently, this tank actually doesn't have any soil in it. The thing that was most popular in those days was to use something called laterite instead. Now, I'm sure lots of you are not familiar with laterite, but laterite is basically a clay granule which was very rich in iron, and this was always sort of traditionally put at the bottom of the aquarium to give a kind of a resource for your plants. I'm sure with having 28 odd years past now, I'm sure there's very little, if anything, of that left now. I'm sure it's long since been utilised by the plants. Anyway, this laterite was just a very, very thin layer, maybe 1/4 of an inch, something like that, on the bottom of the tank. And this was then capped with actually quite a coarse gravel, something round about sort of 5 or 6 millimetres or 1/4 of an inch, something like that. And this coarse gravel was actually then capped with a fine gravel, something sort of 2 or 3 millimetres or 1/8 of an inch. But very much over time, you'll find that substrates sort of sift themselves and move around. So in actual fact, if you look at the substrate today, you'll find that most of the coarse substrate is actually on the top and the fine is on the bottom. This is always what happens to substrates in the longer term. The fine material always sinks and the coarser, heavier material always rises. Anyway, the actual total depth of the substrate in this tank is actually about 4 inches, around about 10 centimetres. Although I will say originally when the tank was actually put together, it was kind of terraced and banked. But like all terraces and things, unless they're actually got a permanent barrier, they always just slip and just level out. So I don't do that anymore. It seems a bit pointless, to be honest. Anyway, the substrate that's in this tank is still the original substrate. It's never really been touched, and it's certainly never been cleaned. I've never siphoned it or hoovered it or anything like that over the time. I've always allowed it to literally just do its own thing and be completely undisturbed. Because of this, sort of not disturbing the substrate over such a long period of time, a natural kind of soil-like sediments have actually built up in the substrate. So in many, many ways over the years, it's actually become a dirtied or a Walstad aquarium, and it certainly functions very much in the same way. So I think it's actually a really good example of how you don't actually have to have soil in a tank to actually grow plants. But I will say it does need a lot more time and a lot more patience to grow plants without soil in a tank. But it clearly shows that this is very possible. And when you look at the tank, it's clearly recycling nutrients extremely efficiently. You can tell this simply by the fact that the tank is still growing plants today, even though I haven't added any fertilisers to this tank for many, many years. The only nutrients that really find their way into this tank are really just from fish food and any water that I top up the tank. There's no actual fertilisers, as I say, added to the tank, nothing sort of artificial, as it were. As you can see on the bottom of the tank here, I allow the mulm to actually build up on the bottom. I don't ever siphon mulm out. I haven't actually ever removed anything like that. I'm sure some of you are probably thinking, well, with all this mulm in the tank, why isn't the water always cloudy? Well, I kind of came across a little, I'll call it a trick, but it's not really a trick, it's more of an observation. It's kind of something that I've discovered over the years. And that's that if you have a really thick carpet of plants, like these cryptocoreans and the mosses and things that I have growing at the bottom of this tank, it actually acts as a sort of a little natural trap. It keeps the mulm sort of contained around the roots of the plants, which is exactly where you want it, because that's where it'll actually be breaking down and supplying the nutrients to your plants anyway. But it also makes sure that very little of this mulm actually gets kicked up into the water column. Although I will say the lemon tetras in this tank are a little bit crazy and tend to spawn a lot. And sometimes when they're spawning, they do kind of stir it up. But it soon settles, either that or the filter actually just takes care of it anyway. So it's not really something that I worry about. One of the actual sort of rather surprising side effects of having mulm in the tank is that it actually makes your fish really comfortable. So they tend to actually colour up much better and much more freely than they do in sort of spotlessly clean tanks. And it's something actually that if you dig in deeply into some really old books and publications, you'll actually find it was mentioned quite a lot that if you want to see your fish at the best is to leave the mulm on the bottom of the tank. It's one of those cold, kind of old little tricks that I think has been forgotten over the years, which is a bit of a shame really, because it really can make a difference to the way your fish look. It also tells us a lot, I think, that just simply observing nature is quite a good way of actually learning things and just seeing how things actually are in reality. You may also notice that there's actually a lot of kind of greenish black below the substrate line. This is actually cyanobacteria, which I know is one of those things that a lot of people detest in tanks because it does have the ability to smother things in some cases. But in actual fact, when you get a really nicely balanced, especially an old established tank like this, the cyanobacteria tends to just find its own niche. And in this particular tank, it's always under the substrate here. It's always been there, but it never ever ventures above the substrate. It just likes it in that particular position and it doesn't cause any problems. It just sits there and does its own thing, as I say. Old undisturbed substrates have a lot of surprising qualities. And in actual fact, somebody asked me recently in the comments, why doesn't this tank go acidic? Especially if you consider this tank hasn't actually had a meaningful water change since around 2010. And pretty much all of the top-up water is actually just rainwater, so there's no minerals in that. And yet the TDS and the pH of this tank are incredibly stable, and the nitrate and phosphate levels are always zero. Well, there's actually many different things at play here, but the substrate actually plays quite a part in this, because lots of the original minerals that are in the water actually end up in the substrate or actually on the substrate in different forms. You could kind of say that the substrate, it kind of becomes a bit like a buffering reservoir really. It's kind of holding all these elements that help to buffer the water and maintain a stable pH. And also in this tank you may have noticed that there's a kind of a mottling sort of to the actual tank backing. Well, that's actually where some of the minerals have actually precipitated out over the years and actually sort of encrusted it. So having these in the tank, again, are all quite useful, because if the pH does try and drop, a little tiny bit of this will then try and dissolve and push the pH back up again. And it's also a reason that I've never ever cleaned the back or sides of this aquarium in all those 28 years. It's, again, just been left. And the snails and things keep it reasonably clean, and it just kind of weathers in, which I kind of like anyway, to be honest. Anyway, on the substrate itself, you may have noticed that there's actually a myriad of snail shells. It's literally 28 years worth of old snail shells, and it's literally just covering all over by the surface of the substrate here. And if you look closely, you can actually see they're all in sort of different states of decay, because some of them will be incredibly old and some of them will be incredibly new. And this is actually something that many years ago I started to observe in my ponds. You would see, again, snail shells in different states of decay absolutely everywhere. And I now realise that this is actually quite a useful and quite important fact, that they're actually helping to buffer and maintain the balance of the tank. And I also think it makes the tank look rather natural, so I kind of like that kind of natural look. I don't like things that are kind of contrived or artificial. And it's one of those things that you can look at with a magnifying glass and see all kinds of different things going on. And it's just a wonderful thing. You can learn so much things from nature. And again, I look at things with a magnifying glass in ponds, and it's one of those sort of things you observe and then you kind of adapt for an aquarium, and then you kind of try and get the same processes and things to actually work and function, and just basically leave them unhindered. That the more you mess around with things, the more things tend to sort of backfire or come back and bite you, as it were. So I'm very much a hands-off, let things be and let things do their own thing. And you may remember that many of the different minerals and things help to buffer the tank. But what we probably don't realise, or maybe don't think about, is that a lot of these minerals, together with all the different elements, they basically go round and round in the system. Every time you allow something decay, like a plant for example, minerals and all kinds of elements are actually released. I should point out this also releases CO2, which tends to actually push the pH down. But in a really well planted tank like this, you'll find that the plants take care of the CO2 so quickly that the actual downward pressure from that is really minimal, and certainly I've never found it's a problem. I've always found that tanks that actually have, or suffer, should I say, from pH drops are always tanks that are rather sterile and definitely lacking sufficient plants, and nearly always are overloaded with fish or overfed. When you get a nicely balanced tank that doesn't have too many fish in it, has lots of plants in it, the pressures to make a tank go acidic are really quite limited. And if you add in all the natural buffering from the snail shells and things that accumulate over time, it really doesn't tend to be a problem. Certainly I've never found it to be a problem. And in fact, sometimes when I've been trying to actually breed fish and I've wanted to lower the pH, I've actually struggled to do it, especially to get it below 7. Tanks are really resilient and don't want to do it unless you really force them into it. One of the other things that you'll find with these really old undisturbed substrates is they tend to become more and more alive and diverse over time. And this isn't just with microorganisms and all the little kind of bacteria, protozoa, archaea and mycorrhizal fungi and everything that you get built up in the substrate. It's actually quite surprising what higher life forms actually accidentally make their way into your tank over time. And especially if you have lots of plant cover like this, it's actually really amazing what kind of little critters will actually survive naturally. In this tank, as I say, if I look at things with a magnifying glass, I can often find little things like cyclops and little ostracods and little water mites and things just crawling around the substrate and underneath the plants. And it's no wonder that the fish dive into this actual amongst the plants regularly and appear to pick at invisible things, because there's a myriad of tiny bits of food for them in there. And it's something I really liked. I like to have tanks that are alive and really diverse, and it just makes it really interesting. And I'm sure a lot of this life has actually simply come from topping up with water out of a water butt. It's incredible what gets into a water butt in terms of life, and my water butt's actually even got a lid on it, so how it gets in there I will never know, but it definitely does. And I've also over the years actually deliberately added quite a few things to the tank, most notably tubifex and other annelid worms. And these I actually collect from my ponds during the summer, and it's something I really like to have in the tank, simply because it adds to the diversity and the sort of decomposition and natural recycling of things, but also it makes your tank infinitely more interesting to actually look at. I was only watching the tank a few days ago, and one of my little Axelrodia tetras suddenly flew out from underneath the plants with an enormous great big tubifex worm hanging out of its mouth, and it sort of shook it and then swallowed it rather abruptly. Just a great little thing to watch while you just sort of sitting there quietly in your front room. Anyway, sometime in the summer, when it's a bit warmer anyway, I'll actually show you a really quick, easy way of collecting some of these worms and things from ponds and then sort of selecting them to put into your tank. It's quite a fun little thing to do, and it can be quite an easy thing to do. But at a risk of kind of sounding like a broken record, I've learned an awful amount from just observing my ponds, often with a magnifying glass. And one of the things or big takeaways really from that I've learned over the years is you simply wouldn't believe the actual diversity and actual quantity of life, or density of life is probably the best way, that there actually is just in the mud and the mulm at the bottom of a pond. It really is quite incredible. And I've actually got no doubt in my mind that if you actually were to take out all these tiny critters and things from a pond or a lake and actually weigh them, the actual mass of them I think would actually be more than the fish in the lake. There really is an extraordinary amount of life that actually crawls around like this. And what you've got to remember is that all of this life is part of nature's recycling system. And although on one hand it may make you think, oh, you're adding more and more life to a tank, you're going to overload the system, it's going to be too much of a bioload. I don't actually think of it or look at it like that, because I think they're kind of bioload neutral in a way, because these are the recyclers. They're not things you're actually having to add extra food to the tank. They're simply taking care of the waste products that are already there from your fish and bits of plant material and what have you that decay naturally. And ultimately, it's this decomposition which releases the CO2 and the other nutrients that your plants need. And the faster and the more efficient this decomposition is, the better your tank will actually work. And I should always point out, or also point out, that I actually have at least half a dozen species of snail in this tank, and lots of shrimps, amano shrimps and neocaridina, all of which are helping this process. And in actual fact, I think of these as kind of the first stage of attack, because they're the creatures or critters that actually chew up all the big material into ever increasingly smaller particles, which then allows the smaller critters to actually take care of the next stages. And ultimately all this process and the substrate and everything all linked together is actually recycling virtually everything. And as I've said many times on this channel, nature basically wastes nothing. It really is a very efficient system. And what I love about this is it brings your tank that little bit closer to a natural ecosystem. And it's just so fascinating to watch. And I'd lose many an hour with a magnifying glass just looking at all this stuff going on in a tank. It's just a whole other dynamic. A tank is not, to me anyway, about just watching your fish swimming up and down. It is an ecosystem, and that's what makes it interesting. How natural it is debatable, but you can certainly use a lot of these processes and things and observations really to make it a really interesting tank to have. I mean, a great little example, the glow lights that I featured in my last little video, I was watching them the other day, and they've actually learnt that the little ram's horn snail eggs, once they start to develop and get near to hatching, they're obviously really tasty, because they just pick them off and chew them up, and they seem to really enjoy them. And again, this just helps keep a natural equilibrium. It stops the snail populations getting out of hand, and it helps to feed the fish. As do all the little kind of tiny babies you get from the amano shrimps and the neocaridina. They're all part of the little bits of food that naturally are produced in the tank. And it all helps the system, and it's all fun to enjoy, as I say. And something also that I really believe is that these long-term, deep, undisturbed substrates, they actually never stop improving. I think it's one of those things, nature has a different time scale to us, and the longer these substrates are in existence, the better and the more stable and the better they function. They're just wonderful things. Anyway, I'm sure I've been rambling along on this subject for a while now. So I guess anyway, you're probably wondering, do I still set up tanks in this way using laterite? Well, the honest answer is no. Apart from the fact that actually laterite is, I'm not sure it's actually even available. I haven't seen it for sale now for many years. The whole idea of a soil or a dirty tank has very much taken over, not just on YouTube and in general, but in my own tanks and my own sort of opinion and things. Using soil actually has so many more advantages to using laterite, and it kickstarts the tank in a much faster and more dramatic way. So I'm very much a fan of doing that these days. I must have set up probably several hundred tanks, both for myself and customers, since this tank was set up. So I've had a really good opportunity to try out many different soil combinations. It's just been a really wonderful learning curve. Some have been very successful, some haven't. And this is something that I will share with you in future videos. And I will hopefully soon start to do some actual setup videos and things as well for you. But this video is really about this tank and its history really over the years. Anyway, if you'd like to know more about my naturally balanced, no water change, unfertilised aquariums, I'd be eternally grateful if you'd subscribe and give me a like. You can also check out my playlists, but most importantly, enjoy your aquarium. Don't be a slave to it. Thanks for watching.